My name is Cara, and I am a 32-year-old middle school teacher. I have spent my entire life feeling like the exact daughter my parents completely forgot to love. While other families celebrated birthdays and graduations with genuine warmth, my family operated entirely like a highly competitive corporate boardroom. My father, Robert, and my mother, Susan, were completely obsessed with massive wealth, high social status, and maintaining a perfect public image. Because I chose a career driven by passion instead of massive profit, I automatically became the ultimate family disappointment. Because of their deep obsession with money, my parents heavily favored my older sister, Olivia. Olivia was a highly aggressive corporate lawyer who had just been promoted to a senior partner at a massive downtown firm. She was undoubtedly the ultimate golden child of the family. My father, Robert, constantly praised Olivia to anyone who would listen loudly, calling her a brilliant financial genius. At the exact same time, he actively went out of his way to brutally mock my incredibly demanding teaching career. During every single family holiday or weekend dinner, my father would deliberately raise his voice across the dining room table just to ask me how my little charity work was going. He routinely belittled my endless hours of grading papers and helping struggling students by loudly calling me just a lowly teacher. He would aggressively shake his head and tell all our wealthy extended relatives that I had completely wasted my intellectual potential by choosing to babysit other people's children. My mother, Susan, never once defended me, but instead she would just smile and pour more expensive wine for my sister. While Olivia was constantly showered with incredibly expensive gifts and lavish praise for pulling in a massive 7-figure salary, I lived a completely different reality. I survived entirely on a strict public school budget, living in a tiny, depressing apartment that had incredibly thin walls and old plumbing. I drove a 10-year-old car and carefully tracked every single dollar just to afford my rent and basic groceries. But the most toxic part of this entire dynamic was that my parents deliberately kept me around just to use my financial struggles as a prop. They deliberately crafted a highly toxic family dynamic where I was permanently viewed as a pathetic failure who simply could not make it in the highly competitive real world. They actively used my low income and my modest lifestyle to continuously elevate the massive ego of Olivia. Whenever Olivia needed to feel incredibly powerful and successful, my parents would simply invite me over just to publicly compare our bank accounts. For 32 years, I quietly accepted this emotional abuse, completely believing that my noble profession made me utterly worthless in the eyes of the people who were supposed to love me the most. Despite the constant disrespect and emotional abuse from my family, I completely refused to let their toxic opinions affect my passion for teaching. I poured every single ounce of my energy into my middle school students. One quiet afternoon, after all the kids had gone home, I found a massive, thick cream envelope sitting on my desk. It carried the official gold seal of the United States Department of Education. My hands were visibly shaking as I carefully broke the seal and pulled out the heavy paper. It was an incredibly rare and prestigious invitation informing me that I had been officially selected as one of only 4 finalists in the entire country for the National Teacher of the Year award. The massive ceremony was going to be held in Washington, D.C., and the ultimate winner would receive their award directly from the Secretary of Education on live national television. For a brief moment, my heart foolishly filled with a desperate and heavy hope. I thought that maybe if my parents saw the official government seal and the prestigious location, they would finally validate my existence. I desperately wanted just a single ounce of their respect. So I took a deep breath, opened our family group chat, and typed a highly vulnerable message begging them to attend. I attached the official PDF invitation with all the incredible details and hit send. Then I sat alone in my depressing tiny apartment and waited. The response I eventually received was absolutely soul-crushing. My father, Robert, was the very first person to reply. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear before he finally sent a brutal text message. He completely laughed at my prestigious invitation and aggressively stated that he was absolutely not flying across the country for some lowly teacher's nonsense award. Before I could even process his incredibly cruel words, my sister Olivia chimed in. She arrogantly replied that she already had highly important dinner plans that night that she simply could not cancel. She deliberately added a deeply condescending smiley face emoji right at the end of her message to maximize the disrespect. But the ultimate betrayal did not come from my father or my sister. It came from my mother, Susan. I sat staring at my glowing phone screen, desperately waiting for my mother to defend me or at least offer a simple, generic congratulations. Instead, a small notification popped up showing that Susan had simply liked the cruel rejection message of my sister. She did not even bother to type a single word to her own daughter. Sitting entirely alone in the absolute silence of my cramped living room, a profound and heavy realization finally washed over me. I finally understood that no matter what massive national achievements I accomplished, they genuinely did not care about me at all. Sitting alone in the deafening silence of my cramped living room, the crushing weight of their profound rejection settled heavily on my chest. I stared at the cheap peeling paint on my walls, feeling entirely and utterly defeated by the people who were supposed to actively support me. Suddenly, the bright screen of my cell phone lit up the dark room. I fully expected it to be another incredibly cruel text message from my sister, but I was highly surprised to see the caller ID. It was my grandmother Eleanor. Eleanor was absolutely not just a typical grandmother who baked cookies on the weekends. She was a legendary and highly respected former school principal. Over her incredibly long career, she had spent exactly 35 years transforming some of the most failing and underfunded public schools in the state into absolute models of academic excellence. In elite education circles, her name carried a massive amount of weight and undeniable power. I slowly answered the phone, and her voice immediately filled the cold room. It was incredibly warm, grounded, and perfectly steady. Before I could even attempt to explain the heartbreaking rejection I had just experienced from my parents, Eleanor completely stopped me. She explicitly revealed that she already knew all about the highly prestigious national nomination. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. When I frantically asked her how she could possibly know about a highly confidential government envelope, Eleanor softly chuckled through the phone. She dropped a massive and highly mysterious hint that completely shifted my perspective. Eleanor explicitly asked me if I had read the details of my official invitation carefully. She revealed that the highly distinguished and anonymous educator who had officially nominated me had secretly nominated exactly 6 other teachers over her long career. She explicitly stated that this anonymous educator possessed massive influence over the national committee, and because her word carried so much weight, every single one of those 6 teachers had ultimately won the award. Eleanor then firmly stated that I was absolutely not going to Washington alone. She promised that she would be flying across the country and would absolutely be sitting right in the ceremony to watch me shine. When I quietly mentioned how my parents had reacted to the news, Eleanor did not sound surprised at all. She calmly told me to completely stop worrying about my highly toxic parents. Her voice dropped into a cryptically calm tone as she explicitly stated that the absolute truth always has a fascinating and devastating way of finding people exactly when they least expect it. As the call ended, the heavy atmosphere in my tiny apartment felt completely different. I was no longer the pathetic family scapegoat crying over a rejected text message. I finally realized that in the massive shadows of my toxic family, I had a highly powerful and brilliant secret ally quietly working right by my side. Armed with the secret knowledge about my grandmother Eleanor, I felt an incredible and entirely new sense of calm. Just 2 days before my scheduled flight to the massive national ceremony, I was forced to attend a highly lavish Sunday dinner at my parents' house. This specific dinner was heavily orchestrated to celebrate the massive promotion of my sister Olivia to senior partner at her elite corporate law firm. When I walked inside, the dining room table was meticulously set with expensive crystal glasses, fine china, and heavy flickering candles. My father, Robert, proudly stood up at the head of the table, raised his expensive glass of wine, and loudly announced to the entire room that Olivia was now officially making a massive 7-figure salary. Instead of simply celebrating her massive financial milestone, the entire table instantly turned their cruel focus to actively mock me. Olivia tilted her head with a deeply condescending smile and arrogantly asked what a lowly public school teacher actually makes these days. I did not flinch or look away. I kept my voice perfectly level and calmly answered that I made exactly $52,000 a year. Hearing that number, the entire table immediately erupted in brutal, condescending laughter. Robert aggressively leaned forward and loudly stated that my teaching career had absolutely no future and zero growth potential. He aggressively told the room that I was completely wasting my life babysitting other people's children. Olivia eagerly joined the attack and publicly mocked my living situation. She laughed while describing my tiny rented apartment, calling my daily life incredibly sad and pathetic. They then brutally shifted their cruel laughter directly toward my upcoming award ceremony. Robert casually waved his hand and confidently assumed my event was just some pathetic little gathering taking place in a cheap conference room. They actively joked that I was flying away just to receive a meaningless paper certificate and eat cheap finger sandwiches. I absolutely did not scream, and I completely refused to shed a single tear for these people. I simply maintained my absolute composure, placed my napkin on the table, and slowly stood up from my chair. As I calmly gathered my belongings to leave, I looked directly at my highly arrogant family. I quietly mentioned that I did not have to pay a single dime for my trip because my first-class plane ticket was fully paid for directly by the United States Department of Education. I smoothly turned around and walked right out the front door, leaving my entire toxic family sitting in absolute dead silence and profound confusion as their cruel laughter instantly died. While my highly toxic family prepared to eat at a highly exclusive French restaurant back in our hometown, actively mocking what they assumed was my pathetic failure, I was stepping into an entirely different reality. I arrived at the breathtaking Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., and the sheer scale of the event completely took my breath away. The massive grand ballroom was absolutely spectacular. It was filled with exactly 2,000 attendees, including the most powerful education policymakers and university presidents in the entire country. Gorgeous crystal chandeliers cast a golden light across a massive sea of round tables draped in expensive white linen. This was absolutely not a meaningless little event in a cheap conference room. There were multiple live television camera crews from CNN and C-SPAN, meticulously positioned at every single angle, ready to broadcast the massive ceremony to millions of viewers across the nation. As I was escorted backstage behind the massive velvet curtains, my heart was pounding heavily in my chest. But when I looked out through a gap in the curtain, I made a beautiful and completely overwhelming discovery. Sitting right in the very front row, directly behind a massive placard that proudly read Guest of Honor, was my legendary grandmother Eleanor. She was not just there as a supportive family member. I suddenly realized the profound truth that completely shifted my entire world. The highly distinguished and anonymous educator who had officially nominated me for this massive national award was actually my own grandmother. Before the massive broadcast began, Eleanor managed to slip backstage to hold my hands. Her eyes were already glistening with deep pride as she looked at me. She softly confessed that she had actively watched my career since the very first day I stepped into a classroom. She explicitly revealed that she had actually wanted to nominate me exactly 6 years ago, but she patiently waited. She knew I needed time to fully find my powerful voice and build my undeniable resilience. She waited until I was perfectly ready to have my name submitted to the highly prestigious National Committee. As I stood there holding her hands, the massive stage lights slowly began to dim across the grand ballroom. A heavy and electrifying silence fell over the 2,000 people in the audience, as the Secretary of Education confidently stepped up to the massive podium to officially begin the live national broadcast. Standing backstage, waiting for my name to be called, I felt a profound sense of absolute peace wash over my entire body. I looked out at the massive television cameras and finally realized something incredibly powerful. I had successfully earned my rightful place among the absolute best educators in the entire country, completely on my own merit and absolutely without needing my parents' permission. As the live national broadcast officially began, the Secretary of Education stepped up to the massive podium, and the entire room fell completely silent. Before announcing the ultimate winner of the highly prestigious award, he paused and looked directly into the television cameras. He announced that each finalist would be deeply honored by a very special guest. When it was finally my turn, a tall and incredibly handsome young man, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, confidently walked out from backstage and stepped right up to the microphone. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. It was Jamal. I remembered him as a quiet middle school student who used to nervously sit in the very back of my classroom with massive holes in his cheap shoes and a constant heavy hunger in his tired eyes. But the powerful man, standing under the bright stage lights, was absolutely not a scared little boy anymore. He was now 28 years old and working as a highly successful pediatric surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Standing confidently in front of 2,000 powerful attendees and millions of viewers watching on live national television, Jamal took a deep, heavy breath and delivered a highly emotional and tear-jerking speech. His voice was incredibly steady as he explicitly revealed his absolute darkest secret to the entire world. He told the completely captivated and silent room that when he was 16 years old, he was entirely homeless, sleeping in the back of a freezing cold car and starving every single day. He openly admitted to the massive crowd that he was completely ready to give up on his education and his entire life because he felt entirely invisible and profoundly broken. Jamal then looked directly at me, sitting in the front row, and his strong professional voice began to visibly crack with raw emotion. He told the audience that I had secretly noticed his silent, agonizing struggles. He explicitly detailed how I had quietly bought him hot food every single week, drove him to desperate interviews, helped him apply for massive college scholarships, and stayed after school for countless exhausting hours just to ensure his basic daily survival. Tears began streaming rapidly down his handsome face as he openly cried on national television. He firmly stated to the world that I did not just teach him how to read, but I literally saved his entire life with my relentless and quiet kindness. Hearing those incredibly powerful words, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom completely shifted. Exactly 2,000 of the most powerful and influential educators in America instantly rose to their feet. The massive room erupted into a deafening and overwhelming standing ovation that literally shook the crystal chandeliers above. I sat in my chair openly, weeping with profound joy, finally realizing that my supposedly lowly teaching career had successfully created a brilliant doctor who was now saving the lives of countless others, completely proving my toxic family wrong. At that exact same moment, hundreds of miles away, my toxic family was sitting in their incredibly expensive French restaurant, loudly celebrating themselves. My sister Olivia had deliberately reserved the best table by the window with a crisp white tablecloth and a silver bucket chilling an expensive bottle of wine. They were aggressively eating meals that cost more than I made in a day of teaching, completely oblivious to the massive national broadcast. My father Robert proudly raised his crystal glass and loudly toasted to Olivia, while actively continuing to brutally mock what they assumed was my pathetic little participation trophy. They arrogantly laughed together, completely assuming I was sitting in a cheap high school gymnasium eating dry finger sandwiches and listening to a boring presentation. Suddenly, the massive illusion of their absolute superiority completely shattered. Robert casually reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out his expensive phone, simply intending to check the evening stock market numbers. But instead of financial updates, a massive breaking news alert from CNN violently popped up right on his bright screen. His eyes scanned the headline, and his hand instantly froze. The massive news alert explicitly announced that a local teacher had just been officially named the National Teacher of the Year. He almost scrolled right past it, but then he saw the live, high-definition photograph attached to the article. His face instantly turned the color of pale paper, completely drained of all its arrogant blood. He stared in absolute paralyzed horror at the live photograph of his own daughter standing on a massive, beautifully lit stage, confidently shaking hands with the United States Secretary of Education. The giant digital screen glowing brightly behind me proudly displayed my name as the ultimate winner. His hands violently trembled as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible reality staring back at him. My mother Susan noticed his terrifying expression and immediately asked if the stock market had crashed. Robert could not even speak a single word to his wife. He simply held out his shaking phone and showed the live national broadcast to Susan and Olivia. Seeing my face on the prestigious CNN feed, Olivia desperately grabbed the phone from his hands. In her absolute panic, her arm accidentally knocked over her expensive crystal wine glass, sending dark red liquid violently spilling all over the perfect white tablecloth, completely shattering her perfect manufactured reality. The three of them were completely paralyzed, forced to sit in terrifying silence as the live video feed switched to Jamal, openly crying on national television. They watched my former student explicitly detail how I had saved his entire life with relentless kindness. As the massive crowd gave me a deafening standing ovation, my family finally realized with absolute crushing horror that my supposedly meaningless little event was actually one of the most prestigious honors in the entire country. As the deafening applause finally began to settle across the massive grand ballroom, I stepped right up to the glowing podium clutching my heavy crystal trophy. I looked directly into the live television cameras broadcasting to millions of homes across the country. I explicitly refused to deliver a generic, safe gratitude speech. Instead, I spoke with absolute clarity about being told my entire life that teaching was a lowly career and a massive waste of my intellectual potential. I proudly stated to the entire world that true success is absolutely not measured by massive salaries or high social status. Then I looked right at the front row and explicitly thanked the only person who ever truly believed in me. I publicly dedicated my massive national award entirely to my grandmother Eleanor, completely and deliberately ignoring my parents. Hundreds of miles away inside that incredibly expensive French restaurant, the social consequences for my highly toxic family were instantaneous and completely devastating. Before I even finished speaking, my father Robert watched in absolute horror as his cell phone violently exploded with incoming calls. His wealthy golf buddies, his brother, and his massive corporate clients were aggressively texting him, demanding to know why he was eating French food instead of supporting his brilliant daughter in Washington. My mother Susan sat completely paralyzed as her own friends and neighbors flooded her phone with highly judgmental messages. To make matters even worse, a stranger in the restaurant actually recognized them from the live broadcast and publicly shamed them for not driving to the massive ceremony. Their completely manufactured public image as the perfect supportive family was violently shattered in a matter of seconds. Desperate to frantically save her own professional reputation, my sister Olivia literally ran into the expensive restaurant bathroom. Her hands were violently shaking as she quickly tried to spin a highly manipulative public narrative. She immediately posted a heavily filtered screenshot of my live television broadcast on her social media pages. She typed out a completely fake and deeply hypocritical paragraph claiming she was an incredibly proud sister and actively lying that family always comes first. She desperately assumed she had successfully managed the massive public crisis. But absolute social karma struck her instantly. A highly respected former journalist, who had coincidentally sat right next to Olivia at a massive networking lunch that exact same day, saw the totally fake post. She immediately left a highly public comment, completely exposing the massive hypocrisy of my sister. The journalist explicitly quoted the exact cruel insults Olivia had used just hours earlier, revealing to the world that Olivia had brutally called my prestigious honor a meaningless little event for lowly teachers. Multiple other powerful lawyers instantly commented to confirm her highly toxic behavior. The massive public backlash was immediate and utterly merciless. Within hours, the horrific screenshots reached the senior partners at her elite law firm. Because their absolute biggest corporate client was a massive education nonprofit, Olivia was permanently and humiliatingly removed from her massive legal case, completely destroying her untouchable golden child status. Exactly 2 weeks after the massive national television broadcast completely shattered their perfect public image, I finally agreed to visit my parents' house for a serious conversation. I absolutely did not go because I was desperate for their delayed apologies, but simply because I was finally ready to face them on my own terms. When I confidently walked through the heavy front door, the entire atmosphere in the house felt entirely different. My family was already seated awkwardly in the living room and they looked completely terrified. My father Robert was sitting stiffly in his armchair, my mother Susan was nervously perched on the sofa, and my sister Olivia looked completely defeated after losing her massive corporate client. Nobody even stood up to greet me because they fully realized that they had permanently lost their ultimate manipulative power over me. Robert desperately tried to immediately reclaim his lost authoritative control by aggressively attempting to gaslight me right from his chair. He loudly cleared his throat and claimed that missing my massive national ceremony was just a simple, honest mistake. He aggressively demanded that I stop overreacting and completely stop treating them like massive family villains over one single missed event. But I completely refused to play their highly toxic family game for another second. I firmly held my ground and looked directly into the eyes of the exact people who had actively belittled my entire existence for 32 years. I kept my voice incredibly level and explicitly stated that reading my official government invitation and consciously deciding that an expensive dinner was more important was absolutely not a simple mistake. I calmly told my father that it was a highly deliberate and incredibly cruel choice. Olivia angrily crossed her arms and arrogantly demanded to know if I just wanted a quick, fake apology so I would finally stop acting so incredibly dramatic. Without screaming, crying, or showing a single ounce of emotional weakness, I established my absolute ultimate power in the quiet room. I explicitly told them that I was completely done desperately trying to earn their respect, and I was completely done apologizing for taking up space in my own family. I established an ironclad boundary right then and there. I calmly announced to my completely silent family that from now on, I would absolutely no longer be their pathetic family afterthought. I told them I would only attend family events when I was treated with absolute genuine respect, and I would only answer their phone calls when I actually felt like talking to them. I explicitly told my father that my true worth never depended on his approval. As my mother began to cry real tears realizing she had lost her daughter, I confidently turned around and walked right out the front door. I stepped out into the cool evening air entirely, leaving them alone with the heavy consequences of their own toxic choices. Exactly 6 months after I confidently walked out of my parents' house and established my ironclad boundaries, my entire life had beautifully and completely transformed. I no longer lived in that tiny, depressing rented apartment that my family used to brutally mock. Using the massive prize money that accompanied my national award, I confidently purchased a gorgeous, sunlit apartment that was more than twice the size of my old place. I was no longer just a local middle school teacher, quietly surviving in the massive shadows of my golden child sister. I was constantly traveling across the entire country, delivering massive keynote speeches to thousands of highly inspired educators. The absolute ultimate validation came in late April when I received a highly exclusive invitation to visit the White House, where I proudly shook the hand of the President of the United States. As I stood in the historic Rose Garden, I briefly thought about my father, who used to loudly call my career a lowly waste of potential. One quiet afternoon, while I was preparing my upcoming lesson plans, I checked my mail and found a highly hesitant envelope. I immediately recognized the strict handwriting of my father, Robert. I slowly opened the letter and read his words. It was a small and entirely defeated apology. For the very first time in my entire 32 years of life, my father explicitly admitted that he was entirely wrong about my career and completely wrong about my true worth. 6 months ago, that single piece of paper would have meant absolutely everything to me. I would have desperately called him crying to rebuild our relationship. But as I read his apology, I felt absolutely no anger and no desperate need for his validation. I simply folded the letter, filed it away in my desk drawer, and felt nothing but a profound and total peace. Looking back at my long, exhausting journey from being the pathetic family scapegoat to standing on that massive national stage, I finally learned the most important lesson of my entire life. I realized that setting firm, ironclad boundaries with highly toxic family members is absolutely never a cruel betrayal. It is a highly necessary and absolute act of human survival. You do not need the permission or the applause of manipulative people to build an incredibly beautiful life. Your true worth is absolutely never determined by the blind people who completely refuse to see it. If you are currently sitting in the dark feeling entirely unloved by your own family, I want you to know that your future belongs entirely to you. If you have ever had to set firm boundaries to protect your own absolute peace from a toxic family member, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear this exact message today, and please subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of ultimate survival and absolute justice.